Good afternoon. Hi, I'm Ben, the site lead, and on behalf of Google Arts and Culture, I'm very excited to have Jamie Bernstein and Clive Gillinson here at Google New York, highlighting the West Side Story project, which was created in partnership with Carnegie Hall, the New York Public Library, the Museum of the City of New York, and the National Museum of American Jewish History. So 2017 is the 60th anniversary of West Side Story's Broadway premiere and is the centenary of Leonard Bernstein's birth. So Google Arts and Culture has initiated this one-of-a-kind project to allow audiences from all over the world to explore a truly great and timeless work of art through thousands of pieces of exclusive, never-before-published archival content, 25 rich, educational, interactive stories, and a groundbreaking 360-degree video of the Carnegie Hall-produced performance of Riff's Get Cool Boy number. So I imagine you all have seen West Side Story. Yes, you're all familiar with, no, I got a no. So, well, you're in for a treat then. I found out about it in 11th grade when my music appreciation teacher made the entire class sing America. But more importantly, more interestingly, I learned in preparation for this event that at one point the name considered was East Side Story, and what a different production that might have been. Maybe Jamie and Clive will tell us more about that. So Google's inviting audiences to dive into the history and legacy of the musical theater masterpiece online. Jamie and Clive today are here to discuss the evolution of West Side Story over the years and why its themes remain so relevant today, and the legacy of Bernstein in his 100th anniversary year. So let me tell you a little bit more about our guests. Jamie Bernstein is a narrator, writer, and broadcaster who has transformed a lifelong love of music into a career of sharing her knowledge and excitement with others. She grew up in an atmosphere bursting with music, theater, and literature. Her father, composer-conductor Leonard Bernstein, together with her mother, the pianist and actress Felicia Montealegre, created a spontaneous, ebullient household that turned Jamie into a lifelong cultural enthusiast. Inspired by her father's lifelong impulse to share and teach, Jamie has devised several ways of communicating her own excitement about classical music. In addition to the Bernstein Beat, a family concert about her father modeled after his own groundbreaking young people's concerts, Jamie has also written and narrated concerts about Mozart and Aaron Copland, among others, produced radio programs and documentaries on a range of musical topics, and she's currently at work on a memoir. Clive Gillinson became the executive and artistic director of Carnegie Hall in July of 2005. He manages all aspects of the world-renowned venue, overseeing the teams responsible for developing the artistic concepts for Carnegie Hall presentations in its 3 halls, from orchestral concerts to chamber music, solo recitals to jazz and popular music, and wide-ranging music education and social impact programs that reach more than 500,000 people annually in New York City and around the world. Clive considers Leonard Bernstein to be one of the greatest influences on his musical life. They worked together when Clive was managing director of the London Symphony Orchestra, collaborating on a number of projects, including the founding of the Pacific Music Festival in Sapporo, Japan. Now, please join me in welcoming Jamie and Clive.
Thanks.
Hello.
Hi, thank you. Oh, that was loud. Thank you, Ben, and wonderful to be here, and really to be able to talk a little bit about this extraordinary project that we've put together around West Side Story in partnership with Google Arts and Culture, who have been truly extraordinary partners in doing this. I'd like to thank them very much for what they've done. And as Ben said, I mean, this really relates, the reason we got involved in West Side Story at this time, it relates absolutely to the 100th anniversary of Lenny Bernstein's birth, as well as the 60th anniversary of the first performance of West Side Story, which is something that has actually been part of life around the world, literally since the first day. I mean, I know even today, there are performances going on in several places around the world every single day of the year. Now, As Ben mentioned, I've always felt that Leonard Bernstein was one of the greatest influences on my life. I mean, he was certainly the greatest conductor I ever worked with, and that was both as a player in the London Symphony Orchestra, but then subsequently as manager. But just to give a sense of the impact he had, I mean, obviously his career here in New York was colossal, but around the world as well. And I remember talking to a member of the Vienna Philharmonic Orchestra when he went there for the first time. And for him, that was a big deal because as somebody of Jewish origin going there after everything that had happened in the war, it was a huge thing for him. And apparently, at the beginning, he sat there and there was huge anticipation. And he was sitting there and he couldn't start. He was so nervous and uptight, and then he was sitting there and he just couldn't start the music. And apparently the players said they were all looking at each other and thinking, oh my God, this is going to be a total disaster. And then he started. And within 10 seconds, every one of them was looking around at each other and they knew this was going to be a love affair for life. So, I mean, the impact he had everywhere he went was quite extraordinary. That was just as a conductor. He was also the greatest music educator I've ever seen. Obviously a great composer, a wonderful and versatile pianist. So his life really, frankly, was many, many people's lives in one. I mean, anybody would have been thrilled just to have lived one section of his life. I certainly learned many life lessons from him. And before we talk about West Side Story and this fantastic resource, I just wanted to explore a few things I learned from him, but particularly to hear Jamie's view on them, as a child growing up with him as her father. I mean, one of the first things, Einstein always said curiosity was the most important thing. Curiosity is far more important than knowledge. And Lenny had an insatiable curiosity. He always wanted to be better at everything he did. Tomorrow had to be better. And his view was that if you couldn't do it better tomorrow, you had failed. And even at the age, I think, of about 60, he threw away all his scores for all the Tchaikovsky symphonies because he wanted to study them all over again without any preconceptions. So, Jamie, I just wanted, as a child growing up in a household with somebody with this unbelievable curiosity, seeking forever for perfection, how was that for you as a child, and how did that impact on you?
Well, it wasn't boring. It was kind of an amazing environment to grow up in. And the thing about my father was that the curiosity that you talk about, it was a symptom, really, of the fact that he combined being a perennial teacher with being a perennial student. For him, teaching and learning were connected activities. And he was a compulsive teacher. Anything that he knew and was excited about, he felt compelled to share. So as his kids, my brother and sister and myself, were constantly learning things from our father, whatever it was, whether he was, remembering a vaudeville routine from his childhood, or telling a Jewish joke, or singing an ad from the radio, or telling us about Mahler's Fourth Symphony. Whatever it was this compulsion to share and communicate the thing that he was excited about. And that's why he was such a good teacher on television. He did those young people's concerts with the New York Philharmonic starting when I was 5 years old, and he went on for over 15 years, I think. There are more than 50 of them. And he was an amazing communicator because he just had this thing that reached out to share his own excitement. And that meant that he wanted to learn as much as he could about everything. And then the minute he learned anything, he had to turn around and share it with the person next to him. So that's what made him such a good teacher.
I always remember, because we did a big project with him at Bernstein Festival in London in 1986. And we had dinners every night, of course, as he always did. And, the most extraordinary people there. And every single person he sat next to, whether it was a nuclear physicist or a painter or whatever, he wanted to understand everything about their life and how their mind worked. And I think what was extraordinary for me about him was he assimilated everything as well. It all became part of what he understood about life.
Right, and in fact, that was his whole thing, was to break down the barriers between genres, or even, to connect seemingly unconnected topics. And that was his whole way of absorbing the universe and then, sharing it back with everybody else. So when it came to being a composer, he was mixing what we call classical music together with jazz and Latin American music and blues and any kind of music that entered his brain, he would absorb like a lint collector in a clothes dryer, and then out from him would come this music that contained the lint from all these other, threads and fabrics that he had absorbed in his brain.
I mean, tell me a little bit about risk as well, because I think one of the lovely things somebody once said to me about Lenny was that he took huge risks. And I mean, that meant sometimes things went wrong as well. But the fact is, he would never take a small risk. And the way they personified it was to say, if Lenny Bernstein was going to fall off a ladder, he would only ever fall off the top rung of the ladder. He'd never fall off the bottom.
I think Steve Sondheim said
was that Steve Sondheim? Yeah. Okay. So,
at least when Lenny falls, he always falls from the highest rung.
Yeah. So, I mean, how was that in your life as a family? How was that personified?
Oh, well, as a dad, he was pretty reliably affectionate and always enjoyed our company. I never felt unwelcome in my dad's presence. So that part stayed the same. But as a family, we had to go through his own career ups and downs, and that put a lot of stresses on us. West Side Story was a giant success, of course, but not every piece of his was a success. In fact, his biggest successes were either before we were born or when we were really young, his kids. And then as we got older, his pieces became more complex and more demanding, challenging of the audiences, and so they were often met with ambivalence. And so we, as his family, experienced that and had to live through that, and it was complicated sometimes. It was.
I mean, Ben mentioned at the beginning that with the London Symphony Orchestra, we created the Pacific Music Festival with Lenny Bernstein in 1990, which was actually shortly before his death. And he was already very sick. And this was a project to bring together the most talented young musicians around the world. And, obviously it was all about his teaching. And we created an orchestra, and he worked with them. And when he arrived there, he was already very, very sick. And everybody was saying to him, "You've got to go home." But he simply would not, because he wouldn't under any circumstances let the students down. And so, I mean, what was astonishing was, he'd struggle to get up and even to get onto the platform to conduct. But the performances, you would have no idea there was anything wrong with him. Because the minute he was in the music, everything else disappeared and he was completely engrossed. But he was asked there, great conductor, great composer, educator, pianist, if you could only choose one thing, what would it be? And he said, "That's easy, to be a teacher, education." Yes, I mean, that's your...
Well, because it was like breathing. So if you have to stay alive by breathing, then he would be a teacher. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and also by being a teacher, that still includes everything else.
So what about his... the conflict, writing West Side Story, I think it was Kusevitsky, his mentor, who said to him, "If you're going to be taken seriously as an artist, you can't write any more musicals like this. You've got to write serious music." For him, that must have been a huge conflict, wasn't it?
It was a huge conflict. Well, back then, there was really no one in the time that he was coming up who was crossing over this way between so-called serious music, orchestras and symphonies and that whole world, and Broadway. And he was going back and forth between writing symphonies and conducting orchestras and then writing Broadway shows. So his conducting mentor, who was from, the old country, Russia and Europe, and had the old-fashioned way of looking at things, and so he was worried that his protege would lose respect by continuing to write for Broadway, that would somehow, disempower his protege or make him not be taken seriously. And he strongly advised his pupil to quit that Broadway nonsense and stick to classical music. Well, luckily, my father was really not good at, following the advice of authority figures. He was always finding his own path. And there were many ways in which that got him in trouble at the time. And even as a symphonic composer, he got in trouble because he liked writing tunes. That's why he liked musical theater, because he liked writing tunes. And in the middle 20th century, 12-tone music was the thing. 12-tone music meant that you were not allowed to write melodies and you were not allowed to write in a key. So the music was very intellectual and thorny and challenging, and you wouldn't go home humming it. So my father was perfectly capable of writing 12-tone music, and sometimes he did, but he didn't want to feel compelled to always have to write that way. But by writing tunes in his symphonies as well as writing 12-tone music, he automatically disqualified himself from being accepted into the pantheon of, what the academics in the music world considered a serious composer. He disqualified himself just by insisting on writing a tune. But of course, now who's got the last laugh? Because his symphonies and other symphonic and orchestral works are so great, and they're so interesting, and they're so kind of broadband because they have all these different musical influences in them, and they have real longevity, because now that we are no longer in this 12-tone straitjacket, his music sounds great to our contemporary ears.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting that he knew that, and
I'm not sure if he knew it, but
Yes.
he wasn't sure. But he was just going to write what he was going to write.
Yes, he
that
just
was
had
the
to be
decision
himself.
he made.
Right.
That was a big risk.
Mm-hmm.
And he knew he was risking his entire reputation as a so-called serious composer. But he was just going to write the way he felt. And now we're glad. But there was no guarantee for him
Absolutely.
that he would ultimately get that last laugh, and he did not get it in his lifetime quite.
No, I mean, certainly the reviewers looked down on music that was tuneful, accessible.
They mostly did. They had bought into that whole 12-tone thing too. It was like a sort of fascist musical state that everyone lived in the mid-20th century. It's amazing to think back to it now because we're so not that way anymore. But in those years, it was tough. And as the musical director of the New York Philharmonic, my father was also responsible for presenting the young composers and their new compositions, and he was very serious about really backing them up and presenting them and making their music as accessible as possible to his subscription audiences. And it was a challenge, but he was devoted to really, supporting them. Mm-hmm. It was a weird time.
So, I mean, to come on to West Side's story now, which in a way we've led up to, I mean, certainly for me, it's the greatest musical ever written. And what I love as well is that for my kids, it's exactly the same. There's nothing generational about it. And it's, as I said, it's something that's being performed around the world every day of every week, all the time. And what brought it together really and led to this Google project, the Google Cultural Project, was the fact that we were celebrating our 125th anniversary at Carnegie Hall in the 2015-16 season, and we were trying to think, what should we do as our creative learning project, which is when we work with kids. These are projects where we work together with a huge number of kids, and they basically learn a piece and to perform in a piece that is something that is normally done by professionals. And there are a few professionals who sort of help to build it out. But we thought, what is our dream of the one piece, if we could just choose one piece to celebrate our anniversary, what should it be? And every single one of us just said West Side Story. I mean, it was automatic. That is what it had to be. And now, as Ben mentioned at the beginning, it started out, I mean, firstly, it was about 10 years in the making, wasn't it? I mean, the team sort of moved away from it in the late 40s and only came back to it again in the mid-50s, and was going to be East Side Story and about the Irish and the Jews rather than the Puerto Ricans and white kids. And it was all about gang warfare, and it was because gang warfare was very much in the news, I think, in the mid-50s, that they came back to it. But tell us a little bit about the genesis, and why this arose again.
Right. Well, yes. The first idea of East Side Story was that it would take place on the Lower East Side, which was where there was a big Irish community and a big Jewish community, and it was going to be all about Jews and Catholics and tempers rising and over the Easter and Passover holidays, you see. This was the original idea. But even back then, the idea was that it would be based on Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet. And the idea that the Romeo and Juliet characters would come from these two different worlds who were at war with each other. So the first idea was the Jews and the Catholics, and somehow they were just not getting traction with that idea, so they shelved it. And when I say they, I mean my father and Jerome Robbins, who was the choreographer and dancer himself, and Arthur Lawrence, the playwright. So then Jerry Robbins, or possibly Arthur, read an article in LA about how the Chicanos were having street gang fights with white street gangs. And then suddenly, the light bulb went on, and he thought, well, what if we still made it happen in New York City, but where there was a big Puerto Rican population, and so the street gang could be Puerto Rican. And the minute they injected that new idea of the Latin American element, everything else fell into place. For my father, it meant that all of a sudden he had this delicious menu of Latin American music to represent the Puerto Ricans in the story. The street gang was called the Sharks. So suddenly, all the sharks and the women and on the characters on that side had all these wonderful Latin American rhythms. And then for the Jets, the white gang, my father used bebop jazz. And so the music was telling the story just as articulately and energetically as the words were. And everything else fell into place too. The dancing, Jerry Robbins could use Latin American dancing for the Sharks and then use all these different angular motions for the Jets. And the set design and the costumes and the colors and everything just fell into place with the Latin American element.
So just for a second, tell us about the relationship between Lenny and Jerry Robbins, because I read once somewhere that somebody said of Lenny, there were only two people that Lenny was scared of, Lenny Bernstein was scared of, and that was Jerry Robbins and God.
That's true. Well, Jerry Robbins was famously scary. He was very intimidating. He really bullied his artists, his actors, and his dancers, and he was famous for being very mean. And during the rehearsals of West Side Story, he actually segregated the cast. And he said, all of you playing the Sharks and all of you playing the Jets are not allowed to speak to each other. You are enemies. And he created this actual discord in the rehearsal process to kind of encourage them to find their inner hostilities for their performance. And I mean, I don't know if that worked or not, but all we can say is the show came out great, so okay. But yes, my father was intimidated by Jerry and by his temper. And my father was the opposite. They were like good cop, bad cop in the rehearsals, because Jerry would reduce everyone to tears, and then they would all go running to Lenny, and he would make them feel better and say, let's just go around the piano and rehearse this number, and you're great, and it's all going to be okay. And he was sort of made of love. That's the way he always was with everyone he worked with. So somehow, in the end, this combination of bullying and love seemed to work in the end.
And when did Stephen Sondheim come into the picture?
Oh, yes. So Steve Sondheim wound up being the lyricist, because originally my father was going to write the music and the lyrics, but it was just too much to take on, and they were running out of time. And so they brought in this kid, this 25-year-old kid, Steve Sondheim, who was a protege of Oscar Hammerstein, as in Rodgers and Hammerstein, who wrote Oklahoma and South Pacific and Sound of Music and all those really big Broadway shows. So Oscar Hammerstein's young protege, very untested, was recommended, and they brought him in as the lyricist, and that all went very, very well. And frankly, I think it's a good thing they brought him in, because he's a much better lyricist than my father is.
The issue of addressing openly big social issues like racism, gang warfare, all of these things, plus a musical that actually ended sad rather than happy, which was very rare.
Well, Romeo and Juliet's a tragedy.
Yeah, but I just wondered, I mean, for him, social issues was a central part of who he was, wasn't it, addressing that?
Yeah, this is such an essential element of my father. It's really the other big piece. He was a conductor, he was a composer, he was an educator, and he was somebody who was always trying to make the world a better place. And what worked best for him was when he could find ways to do that through his own music. And he did that over and over again. And West Side Story is his most famous and successful attempt to use his music to explore the difficulties that we all live with in our world, and to use music as almost a kind of healing process. So in West Side Story, which is about hatred and intolerance and fear of strangers arriving in your neighborhood, and these are all, of course, issues that are as urgent for us today as they were back then. My father's music really gives us a language with which to explore these issues and find our ways to resolve them. I think there was a part of my father that really believed that if he could just write a beautiful enough tune, an urgent enough piece of music, that maybe he could heal the world. I mean, he wasn't crazy. He knew that was impossible. But I think that impulse is what really drove him forward as a composer.
All right. I mean, of course, he never saw the project we did a few years back that is a centerpiece of this. I mean, I was just interested in your take on that, because all of this, as I said before, I mean, this was done with kids, most of whom had never done dancing before. They'd never done any of the things that were expected of them. They ended up doing a performance that, I mean, I know I'm biased, but even as biased, I thought it was the greatest performance of West Side Story I've ever seen. And I'd love your take on the whole project,
yeah. Well,
and what lay behind it as well.
Up there, I'm really sorry my father couldn't have seen it. You know, in his era, he was pushing the technological barriers back in the 50s, and for him back then that was television. And television was in its infancy, and it was his amazing idea to put his young people's concerts with the New York Philharmonic on television, which allowed him to reach this incredibly enormous audience of people who otherwise had never been exposed to this kind of music. So similarly, this West Side Story at the Knockdown Center in Queens brought this music to an enormous segment of the population here in New York City that otherwise would never have been exposed to it. So it was like, taking my father's opening up of music to new audiences through technology to the next level in the 21st century. So he would have been way into that.
Right. So, Jamie, I mean, I've spent a lot of time looking at the West Side Story, the digital presentation that Google Culture put together. I'm just interested in your take just on that exploration.
Well, it's magical. I love it. And I haven't spent nearly enough time yet exploring it. You could really go back to it again and again. That's part of the fun of it, is that it invites you to go back repeatedly to explore different parts of it. It's like a big mansion with different rooms that you can wander around in to your heart's content. So I have to go back and visit the mansion a few more times.
Right.
I think that's what's really cool about it.
Well, and I think, they have created, or you have created, they have created, it's probably the greatest resource that's ever been created around West Side Story, isn't it?
Oh, for
and
sure.
makes it available to the world. And I think when we put on the project with all the kids, one of our incentives or motivations was we wanted to put a project together that could be done by kids anywhere in the world. So to create a template that meant everybody could do this. And I feel this complements that by really opening up West Side Story for everybody.
Yes, well, by putting it on Google, that really does make it available to absolutely everyone around the world.
Yes.
So what could be better than that?
So I just wondered if anybody would like to ask questions to Jamie or to me, either about West Side Story or, other things about her dad as well, who is, I can only reiterate, I think he's probably, genius is an oft-used word and it's used much too often. I think he's the only person I've met in my entire life who I know is a genius. There's lots of other people use the word for, where, they're astonishing talents, but that's not genius. He was. And so I think, his impact on the world of music and so many other things was colossal. So, I think there may be questions about him people want to ask as well.
Any questions?
Should we go to the mics or?
There's 2 standing mics.
So thank you so much for coming, and it was such a fascinating talk to hear about your father and his inspiration. I've actually never seen West Side Story, but
What?
I know, I just moved here.
Well, at least watch the video of the film.
I will, but I'm a huge fan of
Sure, it's on Netflix.
Philharmonic and everything, so I wanted
Great.
them. So what was his inspiration? What was your father's inspiration for being like a constantly curious person? That's like pretty rare to find, especially I think in someone older. So, no offense, but
No, it's true. A lot of people shut down when they get older.
yeah,
It's true.
and especially when he was 60 years old, he like threw away everything, which
Right, the Tchaikovsky
Yeah,
symphonies,
exactly.
yeah, the scores.
So what motivated him to be like that? Like, why was he, or how was he like constantly curious? I don't know.
I don't know. To some degree, it's just an accident of birth, I think. It's just the way his engine ran.
Were his parents like that?
Well, the other part, this is what I was going to also suggest as a possibility, is that his own father, Samuel Bernstein, who escaped Russia when the Jewish people in Russia were being butchered in the pogroms. He escaped at age 17 and came to the United States. And the real immigrant success story, he managed to start his own hair and beauty supply business in Boston and got his whole family through the Depression and was a successful businessman. But his passion in life was the Talmud, which is, this gigantic Jewish religious literature. And he was a Talmudic scholar, and his own intellectual passion about the Talmud was so profound that maybe that somehow was something he passed on to his son, that kind of thirst for knowledge, that passionate curiosity. So maybe my father observed it in his own father and emulated it. That could have been part of it.
Cool, thank you.
I think one of the things I find fascinating, when I look at all the work we do in music education, everything is about trying to stimulate curiosity. Because one of the things, you both touched on it, that, forever is depressing to me, is the fact that you virtually never meet a child who doesn't have curiosity, and you meet so many adults who don't. And the terrifying thought is that maybe our education system is actually knocking it out of them.
That is a terrifying thought.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Okay.
So obviously West Side Story, you're saying it's being performed daily by different people, different countries. What do you kind of see next for it, or is there any type of performance that hasn't happened? Obviously now it's been in virtual reality, it's been on TV, it's kind of been everywhere, but is there anything that else that you would want for it, or that you think your father would like to see with this musical in
Oh,
particular?
there are actually many things in the works. Many things. Well, the film from 1961, I think it is,
Can't remember the name.
is much beloved. It won 10 Academy Awards, including Best Picture. It's one of the most beloved films that exist, especially among filmed musicals. But maybe it's about time for a remake. Well, guess who's interested in remaking West Side Story? Just take a wild guess. What film director? No, that's good,
No.
but he's not a film director.
Right.
Spielberg. Correct. Steven Spielberg has said that he wants to remake West Side Story, so we're really hoping that's going to happen very soon, and that will reintroduce the musical to people who haven't seen it in a long time, and will freshly introduce it to a whole new generation of people who don't necessarily know it, like you. So that's going to be really exciting. And there are also all kinds of new ideas for ways of presenting West Side Story live. So there are going to be all kinds of new theatrical presentations being developed. And then there's this other fantastic way to see the already existing film, and that is with live orchestra. I highly recommend it. If you ever see that it's being performed that way in your community, it happens a lot. They managed, and it's quite a technological feat, because apparently the dialogue and the music were all on the same track on film, but they managed, in their infinite wisdom and magic, to scrub away the orchestra and leave behind the dialogue so that a live orchestra can actually accompany the voices on the film. And it's a really cool way to see West Side Story, because the music sounds amazing when you hear it live, but then you hear it with the film. So that's also out there.
Well, and the other thing I genuinely hope is that, partly because of this extraordinary resource that Google have created, and the way it's opened up the possibility of doing really broad education projects with kids around this, because I mean, it is the most powerful, life-changing experience that any kids we've worked with have ever had working on that project. And the thought that that could be something that people can experience, kids can experience all around the world, and there's no reason they shouldn't. I hope that together we've all created a template that enables it to be shared in very different ways, where people can actually participate, not just as audience, but as participants too.
Yeah, I think interactivity is big, especially with the kids and all that stuff.
Absolutely. There's another.
Sure. Yeah.
Hi, thank you so much for being here. West Side Story is one of my absolute favorites. I never tire of the music. I've seen it countless times. I have a two-part question for you, actually. What do you think drove your father and the creative team to tell the West Side Story, specifically the way that they told it, with such a strong social commentary behind it? They could have just as easily written a very beautiful musical that was just the plain old classic Romeo and Juliet story. And then the second part of my question is, if they were to start from scratch and make it today, what two groups do you think they would have highlighted as opposed to...
Ooh, that's a really cool question.
Very good.
Let's go backwards. Let's do the second question first. I don't know. If you were writing West Side Story, what would your two gangs represent? The alt-right. Ooh. That's a great idea. And there are lots and lots of parodies of West Side Story where they do exactly this and recreate West Side Story with new groups, new opposing gangs. So I think the alt-right would be very interesting,
good one.
especially since, to go back to your first question, all three of the original older creators of West Side Story, Bernstein, Robbins, and Lawrence, Sondheim was young, so he was in a slightly different category, but the three older ones all came up in the 1930s and early 40s in this atmosphere of left-wing liberal values being very central to everybody's experience in the United States. During the Depression and Franklin Roosevelt, there was this movement called the Popular Front, where all these left-wing organizations were considered to be very mainstream, and everybody was very plugged into how this was going to make the world better, and socialism was a big thing, and they were all very interested in what was going on in Russia, and it wasn't until a little later that they discovered how despotic and tyrannical the Soviet Union actually was. But for a while there, they were very idealistic about it. And so I think that their whole leftism really informed their desire to make the world a better place. They were really invested in doing everything they could to kind of lift up audiences and get them to think about how to make their world better and how to overcome any kind of prejudice or injustice or hatred, all of which was very much in the fabric of the United States back then, as it still is today. And that's why Romeo and Juliet was the perfect vehicle to use for West Side Story. And it's why this musical never loses its urgency, because all those issues that were so in the fabric of life all the way back in Shakespeare's day are still with us today. It seems as if it's a little depressing that we never seem to get past it, but here we are all these centuries later, and these issues of hatred and intolerance are still with us. And so Romeo and Juliet still speaks to us today, and so does West Side Story. It's just as urgent as ever.
I mean, I'd be interested in some of your take on the issue particularly about tribalism, because one of the things that genuinely baffles me is I'd assumed that as people get more educated, tribalism would be something that would wane. If anything, when you look around the world now, tribalism is actually more powerful than it's ever been, which is really disturbing. And, I have no idea why that's happening. I mean, whether it's about people struggling for identity or what it is. But I'm just curious as to whether you feel some of these what you feel about some of the themes that are really at the center of this, how you feel they play today.
Anybody have a thought about that?
Couldn't say I would have a succinct answer to that one.
It's a big question.
Right.
I sure don't have the answer. It seems as if we're making progress and devolving at the same time. I mean, even if you're all involved in an organization like Google, which does so much to unite peoples all over the world, it feels as if that is an enormous piece of progress, and yet at the same time, everybody seems to be splintering off into their own little groups and becoming more tribal. So it's as if we're going in two directions at the same time, and I don't quite know how that's all going to shake out.
So, any other questions?
Hello.
Hi.
So the first question is about Shakespeare. So before watching West Side Story, the movie, I also saw many versions of Romeo and Juliet, like in modern adaptations, and none of them really got me. They all seemed out of context. But until I saw West Side Story, and it really struck me as the best modern adaptation of Romeo and Juliet. So I'm wondering how the creative team got inspiration from the original script of Shakespeare.
Well, I think they just read the play over and over again. And there is actually, I think at the Library of Congress in my father's archives, there's a copy of Romeo and Juliet where he's written in the margins and where he's, all these ideas that he's having. So I think that they just immersed themselves in the play. And the more they read it and the more they thought about it, the more they found contemporary resonances. But of course, it didn't really come together for them. It didn't crystallize until they had the idea of the Puerto Rican gangs versus the white gangs. That was the kind of inflection point when it all came together for them.
The second question is about the names of the main characters. How did they come up with the name of Maria and Tony?
Oh, that's a great question. I don't really know the answer to that question, but my brother has a friend who always used to tease us by saying, you know, I don't know why in West Side Story when Tony starts singing Maria at the top of his lungs, why every window didn't open and every single woman in the neighborhood didn't stick her head out the window, because, of course, Maria is such a common name that, you know, you would think like 80% of the women in the Puerto Rican neighborhood would stick their heads out the window. So that was his joke. But I don't know how they chose those two names.
Yeah, and the third question, I'm just curious. What's your favorite score in West Side Story if you have to pick one?
Oh, my favorite song, you mean?
Yeah.
That's a tough one. It changes all the time. But I really love Cool. The music is amazing. And I was talking before about how my father would break down barriers between genres. So Cool uses bebop jazz, but also uses an absolutely correct the fugue form, the way Johann Sebastian Bach did it all the way back in the 1600s, 1700s. So you're mixing a Bach fugue with bebop jazz and all these blues elements, and it's amazingly sophisticated. And the dancing that Jerry Robbins invented to go with it is just so extraordinary. I just think it's one of the best things my father ever created.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
I'll add a different one from me,
Okay.
which is Somewhere There's a Place for Us. And, you know, I think just it's one of the most beautiful, simple, pure pieces of music. And I must have heard it hundreds of times in my life. And I don't think there's ever a time I've heard it when I haven't cried. You know, it absolutely, you know, gets one both musically and it speaks. I remember, I mean, again, to quote Einstein, but Einstein said, anybody can make things more complicated. The real skill is making things simple. And it's a piece of music which is so utterly simple and so perfect, you know, that it makes you weep every time. But it also speaks, you know, somewhere there's a place for us. I mean, it speaks really to, again, this whole thing around identity and people finding a place for themselves. And it's the reason why we chose it. I mean, we actually called this West Side Story production. We built around it something we called the Somewhere Project, where we worked with school kids, you know, in huge numbers, you know, where they developed songs around that. I mean, you know, and what it meant to them. So, I mean, that certainly for me is the number. But, I mean, you said it's your favorite piece, which is the, you know, West Side Story is. So which number?
Probably tie between Somewhere or One Hand, One Heart.
Right.
Yeah, the One Hand, One Heart is beautiful too.
Yeah.
Actually, my favorite one is America, because the music, the choreography, and the lyrics were just so perfect.
So perfect. So I just saw a concert version of West Side Story with the Philadelphia Orchestra in Philadelphia. And when they sang the song America, there was no choreography. Everybody was just standing there doing the music and the singing. And when they got to the line, nobody knows in America, Puerto Rico's in America, Yannick Négué-Séguin, the conductor, stopped the music. And there was this gigantic, deafening pause. He stopped the music so that line would resonate in the air. It was right after the hurricane. And there was this incredible silence in the hall, and then everybody went, yay! Wow. It was very, very moving. Oop, excuse me. It's so true about the song Somewhere, and Steve Sondheim's lyrics really speak to us now because there are so many displaced people in the world right now between you know, refugees and hurricanes and fires, and there's just so much upheaval in the world, and so many people who are looking for a place somewhere to feel safe and you know, peace and quiet and open air.
Yeah, when I heard it, I thought this is still so relevant today.
Yes, more than ever.
Thank you very much.
Well, I think it speaks to the power of West Side Story that between us, I mean, just at the beginning, we've got 4 different numbers that we all think are the greatest. And actually, we could all choose any of them.
Yeah, good.
So, any other questions? In that case, I think from both of us, it's a huge thank you to Google Arts and Culture for creating this resource,
Thank
and
you.
particularly to Amit Sood, who was there right at the very beginning. I mean, he was the one who loved the idea and made sure it happened. But I think it's a project about something we all love and all care about, and to see that it's going to be made available to the world in a way that could never have happened before, I think is very moving for all of us involved. I mean, particularly, obviously, Jamie and her family, but I think all of us, because music really is part of a shared heritage. So, I mean, thank you to Google Arts and Culture. Thank you to all of you for sharing it with us and for being here today. I mean, it's been great to talk to you.
And thank you, Clive.
Well, and you, Jamie. Thank you.